On today's show.
We started our sex worker project over 20 years ago, I think 21 years ago. And at that time, no one was talking about it. No one would talk about it. Do you come across people that you either are not attracted to or you don't like, but they've hired you and you have to perform, whether it's taking somebody on a date, out for dinner, or full service? Tell us what that's like.
That's very real, Doug. And, I have rarely been asked this question, if ever, after years of media work around this issue. So I really appreciate you asking, again, what other people don't ask.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the social justice podcast, Beyond the Box. We'll go beyond the headlines and typical stories by having a challenging and incisive discussion. I'm your host, Doug Lasdon, founder and executive director of the Urban Justice Center. Today, we're lucky to have RJ Thompson-Rodriguez, the project director at the UJC Sex Worker Project. RJ has been a sex worker and for over 20 years, a human rights attorney. We're going to start by talking about what it's like being a sex worker and then explain some legal and policy issues. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get going. Welcome, RJ.
Thank you so much, Doug. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Glad to have you. Let's start by defining the phrase sex worker. What does that mean?
Okay, so sex work is a broad umbrella term that includes many different labor sectors where people exchange something of value for sexual or erotic services. Oftentimes that's money, sometimes housing or other things. And this includes both legalized sex work, including go-go dancing, stripping, and adult film, as well as work that is currently criminalized across the United States, which we refer to as full service work or escorting.
Great. And can you tell us what your experience as a sex worker has been?
Absolutely. So I had started doing sex work in college as a go-go dancer. That was sort of my entry point. That led to full nudity stripping, which I did while I worked at Amnesty International in DC. So I worked at a strip club off Capitol Hill, which was interesting because actually a lot of legislative staff were customers there. And I was doing anti-death penalty work at the same time. This was before law school. So my sex work and my human rights advocacy have always sort of happened on parallel tracks, simultaneously and overlapping. And then later on, I did porn, adult film for many years. Once I moved to New York, I started that part of my career, and that overlapped with law school as well, and then moved into full service work several years later, which really was instrumental in me helping to get me out of debt as a public interest lawyer, and really helped to change the trajectory of my life financially, but also emotionally and spiritually, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about.
Thank you. It's refreshing to hear just how honest and comfortable you are with who you are now and who you've been, and I've always appreciated that.
Thank you.
There's a part I want to talk about, and that is so many people think of sex work as really just about sex or lurid sex, and people protest that. But in our conversation, there's an aspect about sex work I've always been impressed by that I think the public doesn't understand fully or at all, and that is that you've talked to me about working with people who are lonely or who have other issues, and so much of sex work is about that. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Absolutely. So two things come to mind with that question. One is people often have this overemphasis, as you say, around the sex part of sex work, but they also oftentimes ignore the sexuality part. So there's a duality there that I think is important to name. On the one hand, sex work does involve more than just the sexual or sex acts. Many times there's companionship-based sex work, and we do include it in the term sex work because sometimes there are sexual activities involved, sometimes not. But on a deeper level, at the core really is companionship. A lot of clients are seeking companionship because of loneliness, social anxiety, sometimes disabilities, ageism, and body shaming in different communities, including the gay male community, where people find it difficult to date or have sex on apps or from bars or what have you. And so for some people, for many varied reasons, it's more comfortable for them to seek out the companionship of a sex worker who is hopefully not going to judge them, is going to treat them as a human being. And I've been told many, many times, actually, which is one of the most fulfilling things for me about sex work, that people have felt seen by me and treated as just a basic human being with basic dignity, which of course we all should be treated with, but is not always the case for many people, again, because of age or disability or many varied factors. And so people have told me, that beyond any of the sexual services, making them feel seen and validated and not judged has been a really important reason why they rehire me and why they see sex workers in the first place. But the other part, you had mentioned sort of lurid sex, quote unquote, and I really push back against anybody who judges sex work from a moralistic point of view, because human sexuality is a basic and fundamental part of being human. And as you know, in our society, we're raised that it's taboo to talk about in the public sphere, sexuality that is, let alone sex work. So at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, it's important for us to destigmatize sex and sexuality more broadly, because without doing so, we don't think sex work is going to be destigmatized.
Great. I want to talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about policy issues. It's almost like the sex worker is a helping profession. Interestingly, you have told me in the past about people have hired you for hugging sessions. Is that...
Yeah, I do think it's a helping profession. I think that sex workers provide, as I often say, value-creating services for people who want and or need them. In a few countries in the world, sex work is actually seen as social services. And in a couple countries in particular, is viewed as a social service, particularly for people with disabilities, that is sometimes even funded by the government. So this is a dramatically different view of sex work than we have in this country. And yes, I've been hired for simply cuddling, as much as an overnight for just that, to be able to, as many clients say, have human connection, human touch that they otherwise are not having in their life is transformative and so valuable for them. So again, whatever someone's perspective is on sexuality, I think that we can all agree that human beings deserve companionship and affirmation and basic connection.
Great. This is a perspective on sex work that people really need to hear. What do you say to critics who say that sex work is demeaning work?
Well, I would argue that it's important not to treat sex work as some sort of monolithic experience, that there are as many experiences of sex work and the sex trades as there are sex workers. And so, like any profession, it's not a one-size-fits-all experience. And a lot of people try to make the experience of sex workers basically boil down into two extreme narratives. One that is only empowering, that is only about sexual liberation, and the other extreme that we are victims, usually women portrayed as victims, and that we need rescue, really. And so these two extremes of sort of what we refer to as the happy hooker narrative and the victim narrative do exist, but they do not represent the vast majority of people on the spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion as we talk about the sex trades. And so I think that when people say that we are being demoralized or used or abused or don't value ourselves, that again comes from this very sex negative perspective, one. Two, it takes away agency and autonomy and self-determination from sex workers. And for so-called feminists who say that women are always oppressed from sex work, I often say, you believe in choice and agency, right, in other contexts like reproductive freedom. So why suddenly do women not have choice and autonomy around this issue?
Speaking about the demeaning aspect, I can't help thinking that while there are demeaning jobs, people have demeaning jobs in all sorts of things, that sex work might go a step further. With full service sex work, you are giving away something that is a little more intimate and a little more personal and perhaps going a little too far. I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yes, I've certainly been asked about that. This is provocative, right? But I know that we're going to ask the hard questions in this session, so I really appreciate that. It's very important to distinguish between work and exploitation, first and foremost. My definition of work or labor from a human rights perspective is that work can never be coercive or exploitive. Now,
work should never be exploitive.
Well, I'm going to say that actually, if it is exploitive, it's something other than work.
Okay.
So that's what I'm saying. From a human rights perspective, work, as you say, should always be freely chosen. There should be certain standards that are human rights based around wages and treatment of workers in all professions. Now, exploitation also happens in many professions. People talk about it in the sex trades as being sort of rampant, but many people who do all sorts of labor, including farm labor, domestic labor, fast food labor, experience different levels of exploitation in those trades. And I would say that although sex work can be deeply intimate, and I will say honestly that there can be an emotional aspect to what you carry from those sessions because of that intimacy, that for some of us, it may be a lot emotionally to hold, not just physically, but also I think that there are many other professions that include our bodies and that include intimacy. And people don't always think of this. For example, hospice care or even just nursing in general, I would argue is a very intimate job. You may be helping people use the restroom. You may be bathing people, right, who are vulnerable and nude in that scenario. But for some reason, I don't think people think of those jobs as intimate in the same way that they do sex work. And I would argue that they are. Also, people use their bodies in many types of jobs, construction, labor, and all sorts of jobs where the body is being used physically. But because sex work involves sex, oftentimes, people see that as somehow different from other forms of bodily labor. And for many of us, if we're using our bodies for labor, we're using our bodies for labor. And because we have a positive view of our sexuality, for me, speaking for myself, that's not different really than using my body in some other form of physical labor.
I'm sorry that if this is a sexist question, but I can't help it occurs to me, might there be a difference between, in this question of intimacy and giving up something perhaps too intimate? Do you think there may be a difference between men and women sex workers?
So as a cisgender man, I will never speak for women's experience,
Fair
but
enough.
I will say, as a person who believes that there is huge gender inequality still, and that we live in a patriarchal society still, that of course there is sexism and power dynamics within client or customer and worker relations. But again, I would argue, we're always trying to sort of normalize in a sense that sex work shares many of the pros and cons of other forms of labor. So unfortunately, women in our society experience sexism and gendered power dynamics in probably every job, from law firms to being servers in a restaurant. And so for us, the distinction again between sex work and sexual harassment, for example, is extremely important. Just because we're sex workers, people sometimes assume anything goes, that they own our bodies for that period of time. And regardless of gender, that's simply not true. Workers still have autonomy to say what we will and will not do, and the parameters and boundaries within that particular exchange. So I think the experience can be very different for people of different genders, and our privilege as male sex workers sometimes keeps us safer, sometimes maybe makes us feel less vulnerable. But I think that every single person's experience is different. And if you were to ask women sex workers this question, you'd probably get many varied answers.
I'm sure I would. Thank you for that.
Now this message. We're here with Michael Barish of Barish and McGarry, lawyers for the 9/11 community. So 21 years after 9/11, incredibly, most of the 500,000 people who were exposed to the deadly toxins still don't know they're entitled to free lifetime health care and compensation. Why do you think they haven't enrolled?
Two reasons. First, many non-responders tell me that they didn't realize that no matter their family history, nearly every cancer has been linked to the exposure to the World Trade Center toxins. Second, many of them feel guilty and they don't want to take from others who have died. Thankfully, you won't be taking money from anyone since the Victim Fund and the health program have been fully funded by Congress. Susan, millions of dollars remain unclaimed. It's so important that you register. 68 cancers have been linked to the toxins. Remember, 9/11 didn't end on 9/11.
Contact Barish and McGarry today at 911awards.com. That's 911awards with an S.com.
Tell me what it's like Being a sex worker, especially with full service work, but with other sex work as well, do you come across people that you either are not attracted to or you don't like, but they've hired you and you have to perform, whether it's taking somebody on a date, out for dinner, or full service? Tell us what that's like.
That's very real, Doug. And, I have rarely been asked this question, if ever, after years of media work around this issue. So I really appreciate you asking again what other people don't ask, because I think it's important to know the realities of our experiences. So I would say first and foremost, there's a difference in experience between people doing what we would call survival-based sex work, who are doing sex work to literally live day to day, whether that's putting food in their mouth, clothes on their back, housing, basic needs. And for those sex workers, there is most likely a lot less discretion available to them about who they may or may not choose to have as a client. So again, privilege plays into this. From my personal perspective, I have been fortunate enough to be able to have a lot of choice and discretion because I have had other jobs or income potential in addition to sex work. And while I have done sex work for financial reasons, because of debt, for example, I also have done it because I enjoy it and I'm good at it. So that's where choice and circumstance overlap. So for me, yes, there's certainly people that I decline to take on as clients for many different reasons. Sometimes that is how they speak to me in the initial exchange, which is often online, where I can get a sense of whether this is a respectful person or not that I want to spend time with. When it comes to physical attraction, I think there is a stereotype around who hires sex workers, around age, around looks, around gender. And actually, there are clients of sex workers who are 22 years old, 78 years old, and also attraction is subjective, right? So I have been attracted to some clients. There are some clients I would have sexual experiences with, even if they didn't hire me. There's other clients who I'm able to do certain acts with and not others. And we sort of figure that out beforehand so that boundaries are clear. And then, like you said, sometimes you just don't gel with a person personality-wise, and it can be challenging to spend 2 hours or 12 hours with somebody, just like if you were going on a date. Maybe it's not your favorite conversation or your favorite connection.
There are a lot of jobs that are difficult. People
Yes.
work in fast food or certain factory work, let's say, or I don't know what. People go to have all sorts of jobs they don't want, and they count down the minutes and the hours, and it's every day, and they go home, and it's difficult. Can you compare it to that in any way?
Yeah, as we often say at SWP, we never seek to demonize the sex trades or romanticize them, because the reality is that every individual circumstance is different. I often say, in any job you have good days and bad days, better days and worse days. I've been a restaurant worker. I've had other types of jobs that in one location I might enjoy it. In another, I'm counting down the hours till it's over.
Is it fair to say that in the sex trade, it's worse for some reason because it's more personal or intimate?
I push back on that. I don't think that it is. Again, with a lot of these questions, I really want listeners to try in their minds to think about sex work as labor and work in the sense of any other job. And I think in our minds and in society, we're raised with this hierarchy of jobs, right? So being a doctor or a lawyer is like the ultimate for some people, in terms of having a successful job. Doing manual labor of some sort is seen in our culture as demeaning or something that migrants are supposed to do and other people don't want to do. And for me, I think work is always valuable. By that, I mean there's not a hierarchy of work. And I wish we could sort of understand you can be a doctor and have a horrible day or be counting down the minutes until you're done. Or you could be a doctor and actually that's not your passion and you're doing it because of family expectation or money. So we need to think about jobs and work as sort of a spectrum that has good and bad, pros and cons. And I really don't see the sex trades as very different.
Yeah, I would add that without saying which work for which person, that some work is more personally fulfilling and therefore more generally more enjoyable. Not always,
Certainly.
but
Certainly.
that is the privilege. That is the privilege that some of us have, I think.
I agree. And I think that's true for sex workers as well. Some sex workers, on the whole, love their job and love being sex workers. For the most part, I love doing sex work. Overall, it's more positive than negative for me. It's been very empowering. And that is not unique. There are
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of sex workers who would say that. But like in any job, as you say, it's really about, am I doing something that I hate? If I hate doing it, why am I doing it? Do I have other options? And I really think it's important to look at, when we talk about choice, circumstance, and coercion in the sex trades, I say in trainings all the time, that spectrum exists in every career path.
Sure.
If you think about your own life, I always ask people, whatever career or job you have, why are you doing it? If you went to law school, like I did you do that because your family expected it? Did you do that because you wanted to make six figures? Or did you do that because your heart told you, this is what I want to do?
But a lot of people in the sex trade, I don't know what percentage, maybe you have an idea, I don't even know if anybody has an idea, are doing it because they have to, because they have no other choices or real choices.
So again, the spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion is the spectrum that people exist on in the sex trades. And we don't have hard numbers for that. But I would say that goes to the lack of research around this particular topic and why SWP engages in research. Because basic questions like how many sex workers are there, we don't know. And that's because of stigma and criminalization in large part. You know, I would add that I don't know that it's super important that we have a hard number, though, because in terms of who's doing it for what reasons, only in the sense that choice, circumstance, and coercion are also not boxes, just like the podcast suggests, beyond the box. They bleed, overlap, and intersect, right? So I did it by choice and circumstance.
And that really exists in many jobs,
Right.
Those same choices. What was it? Choice?
Choice, circumstance, and coercion.
Yeah,
So
for many jobs.
I chose to do sex work, absolutely. But many people would say, yes, I freely chose to do this, but I also had circumstances, my migration status, my gender identity, my income needs for doing it. And then also circumstance and coercion can start to overlap, because think about if you've had a job, any job, that you just could not wait to leave from and it was miserable, can't that feel coercive, right? At a certain level. So.
Hi, everyone. We're trying to get the word out about the podcast. So if you like it, please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app, and please rate us 5 stars on the Apple Podcast. And finally, please pass this episode on to your friends. Thank you for your support.
Now this message. We're here with Michael Barish of Barish and McGarry, lawyers for the 9/11 community. So 21 years after 9/11, incredibly, most of the 500,000 people who were exposed to the deadly toxins still don't know they're entitled to free lifetime health care and compensation. Why do you think they haven't enrolled?
2 reasons. First, many non-responders tell me that they didn't realize that no matter their family history, nearly every cancer has been linked to the exposure to the World Trade Center toxins. Second, many of them feel guilty and they don't want to take from others who have died. Thankfully, you won't be taking money from anyone since the Victim Fund and the health program have been fully funded by Congress. Susan, millions of dollars remain unclaimed. It's so important that you register. 68 cancers have been linked to the toxins. Remember, 9/11 didn't end on 9/11.
Contact Barish and McGarry today at 911awards.com. That's 911awards with an S.com.
You know, I want to start talking a little bit about sex work policy and laws, but let's start by talking briefly about violence and the potential for violence in sex work, because I know it's amongst the most dangerous professions.
Well, we certainly see violence in the sex trades, and we see that violence at the hands of some clients. I would argue the minority of clients. Most clients of mine and people I know in the sex trades are good people who treat us well, but there are clients who exhibit violence against sex workers. And police violence has been rampant towards sex workers globally and across this country for decades. It's a huge problem, particularly when the police in this society have been set up with units like vice squads, including here in New York City, where their purpose from the outset has really been to be morality police, in a sense, and to enforce those things that are criminalized that, in our opinion, should not be, that are adult consensual behavior. So sometimes police abuse their authority, particularly with street-based sex workers. We have seen cases of sexual assault, of rape against sex workers many times, and often sex workers do not come forward and report that violence because of fear of criminalization, and if they're migrants, deportation. And so violence in the sex trades is real. But again, I would say that violence also happens in other labor sectors, and that we need to pay attention to violence and exploitation across all labor sectors.
Sure. We started our sex worker project over 20 years ago, I think 21 years ago. And at that time, no one was talking about it. No one would talk about it. The policy here in New York and around the country, if not the world, was to arrest sex workers, put them in jail for a night and let them go, and repeat that 20 or more times. It has been interesting to see over those 20 years how that has changed. We are now talking about sex work around the world. Countries are experimenting with different policies and different laws. And in this country, we're starting to experiment with some different policies and laws. I might say a little slower than some of the other countries. But is it fair to say that there are two leading models, the Swedish model and the Dutch model? Can you tell us what these two models are?
Yeah. So we have these two sort of camps in the United States of folks who want to address the issue of sex work in two very different ways. We at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center believe in full decriminalization for all adult consensual sex work. And it's important that we note adult and consensual because we are only speaking about adults in this context, not minors, and we are only speaking to sex work that is consensual, not coerced, forced, certainly not trafficking. And full decriminalization would allow people to have that choice and agency to exchange sexual and erotic services as they want and need without fear of arrest and all of the collateral consequences that come with criminalization, including housing, travel, immigration, and on and on.
When you say the decriminalization model, is there room there for health and safety regulations, or do you want to just decriminalize and people can do whatever they want regardless of health or safety?
So for us, decriminalization is a first step, and what I would name as human rights-based labor regulations would be something we would absolutely support and think is needed, as should be applied to all labor sectors. And when I say human rights-based, by that I mean a key part of that is that directly impacted people, sex workers ourselves, should be informing those regulations and those policies.
As in any industry for health and safety.
Yes. Basic principle of human rights is that those directly impacted have a majority voice in creating policy.
Right. But of course, as in any industry, there's also room for experts, scientists, and other experts to come in who might not be sex workers, but might understand human health.
I think there is room for that with two caveats. One, that in any human rights issue, including any worker rights issue, I believe that those experts need to understand their role as allies if they're not from that directly impacted sector. The same would be for street workers, restaurant workers. I've done restaurant worker rights, and we had a restaurant worker-led movement for that. So it's important to note that workers of all sorts have the power and the knowledge and the skills to say what is best for our lives. But at the same time, my other caveat is we are also experts. Here at the Sex Workers Project, we have sex workers on staff who are social workers, who are educators, who are lawyers like myself. And we know sex workers who are PhDs and researchers who have also worked here. So it's also not an either or, right? And in our research work, we make sure that sex workers who are researchers are deeply involved in everything that we do research-wise. Mm-hmm. But, I do want to explain the other model, which has several names that can be very confusing, maybe to your listeners, because they essentially mean the same thing. the Nordic model, aka Swedish model, aka end-demand model, and most recently, equality model, which is a strategic political choice to call it that, means that we continue to criminalize customers or clients of sex workers, as well as, importantly, third parties. And third parties means in the penal law, it's usually people who are promoting or facilitating prostitution. And people think that that just means pimps, basically. But that can be, in my own life experience, for example, my ex-boyfriend who would drive me to a client's house for safety or wait for me.
Or security. You could call it a pimp, but you could also say, I need to hire security.
Right. And that's an outdated term, pimp. But really, in many cases, there are people who act as managers with sex workers. And just like clients, these are not all abusive, exploitative people. These are often people in our own networks and circles who are helping sex workers stay safe. A person can also be charged with promoting or facilitating prostitution for providing housing to a sex worker, for example. Yeah. And so this model, the Nordic model or end-demand model, seeks to continue and focus criminalization on all of those people, third parties and clients, but stop criminalizing workers.
I've always thought that that was sort of a grudging compromise by people who really want to keep sex work illegal, but are willing to say, okay, let's not arrest the sex worker, because criminalizing it for the client still drives it underground.
Yes.
And then you can't have the protections. And as I've talked about, the health and safety regulations. So I've never had a lot of respect for that model. And I'm sorry to see that it keeps rearing its ugly head whenever the topic comes up.
In countries who have implemented this Nordic or end-demand model, including France, we have statistics that show that violence against sex workers increased because, as you say, it was pushed underground. People have to do the exchange in a park outside the city or whatever that is more isolated and vulnerable. Also, the people who are promoting this, including some who would identify as second wave feminists, we call carceral feminists, are truly anti-sex work at the end of the day.
Yes, I think that's right.
And this is about optics, and it has become about sort of getting liberals to see this as a valuable compromise position or an incremental position when in fact it's directly harmful to sex workers. It takes away business from sex workers, again, some of whom are in survival mode and need that business. It's like I often say, suggesting you can have a restaurant that can be open, but you can't serve any clients or customers. People would find that absolutely ridiculous. And also, criminalizing our clients and customers often has racial justice implications. Very few people talk about that. It's important for us to note our clients here at the Sex Workers Project, our legal services clients, often have customers who are intra-community. So it's not this sort of pretty woman image of a wealthy white man coming to exploit some woman, but often migrants in Queens, for a very tangible example, doing street-based sex work. Their clients are also migrants from Queens, and they're not enemies, you know? Right. And so, like any criminal justice policy, arresting our clients and customers is going to land disproportionately, and does already land disproportionately, on Black men, on poor men, on migrant men, for the most part.
Okay, we have a little time left. I want to cover two things. I want you to talk about some current issues that you're working on, either local or national. And then I want to spend some time talking about your views that we need to be a more sexually liberated society. So take a few minutes and tell us about some things you're working on.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the important work of SWP.
And actually, let me interrupt before you answer, but there is an opportunity to go on to the Urban Justice Center's website and to go to the Sex Worker Project's website to learn more and contribute if people would like to contribute. Yes. So tell us what you're working on.
Yeah. The Sex Workers Project website is part of the Urban Justice website, swp.urbanjustice.org. We always deeply need people to step up and contribute at whatever level they can. This is a deeply under-resourced movement. And we work in 4 programmatic areas. We do free legal services, primarily currently immigration legal services. Our legal team are national experts on the intersection of migration, sex work, and human trafficking. And we serve both human trafficking survivors and sex workers. which are two distinct but sometimes overlapping populations. And we always have served both. We've always been an anti-trafficking organization as well as a sex worker rights org. So immigration legal services has become really one of our areas of expertise. And also we have an incredible film series that it seeks to destigmatize sex work. One film is called Sexual Healing. The other is Family Matters. And it looks at sex workers as healers, like we've discussed today, but also as parents and family members. My niece and I got to be in that iteration of the film series, talking about how stigma and criminalization not only harm sex workers, but our families, especially for parents, having to fight custody and visitation battles, even when they're doing legal sex work, for example, because of stigma. And we also do research and policy advocacy. We're trying to get support for passage of the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act here in New York, which is the full decrim bill here in New York. There is a Nordic model bill, unfortunately, in New York that people are confused about the differences on. And so we do a lot of education around the two different bills and why full decrim is the human rights policy solution. And finally, we've just released our DA toolkit, which is a tangible best practices toolkit for prosecutors across the country who want to implement local non-prosecution policies. So because the penal law is state level, until states are willing to decriminalize adult consensual sex work, DAs have the discretion to stop prosecuting adult consensual sex work, and many have, from Los Angeles to Washtenaw County, Michigan, to Baltimore City. And so our research department has done an outstanding toolkit to help DAs who want to do that be able to do that well.
Great, thank you. Just to have some concluding thoughts, I know you think that all of this happens in a context of what you see as a sexually repressed society, and that we need to have a more sexually liberated society. Do you want to talk about that just for a minute? Yes. I know it's near and dear to your heart.
Thank you for the opportunity, Doug. I think this is one of the reasons that the Sex Workers Project thrives at the Urban Justice Center, because of your leadership and your lack of stigma and ability to let all the projects at UJC be the experts on their issue and their community, and that's why it works. So sexual freedom, sexual liberation is an important value for us, just like worker rights is, and gender justice and racial justice. These are all intersecting movements with sex worker rights. Sex work touches, as I've said, on migration, on racial justice, on economic justice, gender justice, and sexual liberation. Many organizations don't go there, to the sexual freedom and sexual liberation part. And we've seen that history repeated in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movement. We've seen that in the reproductive justice movement, what we call in the human rights world, sexual rights movements that have to do with sexuality and gender. Often the sexual aspect or the sexual freedom aspect has been played down. And that's often because of respectability politics. So in the LGBT context, there was a day not long ago when people who were leather people or drag queens, and we see the attacks on drag queens right now, again, that are not respectable queers should not be front and center of the movement. There was a time in the LGBT movement where literally lesbians wore dresses and gay men wore suits and ties to march here in New York City even. That's in many of our lifetime. And that is an assimilationist strategy that might have short-term gains because people can relate to something they feel more comfortable with. But at the end of the day, what is the point in fighting for human rights if people are not allowed to be themselves? Whatever they look like, whatever they want to wear, as long as they're not harming someone else. In the United States of America and around the world, we should be able to have bodily autonomy, freedom of expression. These are basic human rights. And in a place that supposedly has separation of church and state and supposedly is the land of the free, we need to stop worrying about what other adults are doing with their bodies, with their labor, with their sexuality, with their time. And, you know, a huge part of this is the intersection of authoritarian religion and public policy, which should not be mixed.
Thank you very much, RJ Thompson-Rodriguez. I just want to conclude by saying I've always found RJ to be smart and a decent person, but it just as importantly, if not more importantly, he's got a quality that is all too rare in our society that we call wisdom. Thank you, RJ, for sharing your wisdom and intelligence with us today. And we hope a lot of people listen to this.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it so much.